Welcome to everyone, and thank you all for coming. We're delighted to see such a great turnout this is basically the first day back from spring break. So I'm glad that this many people were able to find themselves in their educational journey. So welcome to the Spring Colloquium for the Department of Economics and Business. We're grateful for sponsorship by the City College President, Lisa Koiko, and the Colin Powell Center for Leadership and Service. Professor Sachs's career as a public intellectual and policymaker is an ideal complement to the mission of the Powell Center and Colin Powell, class of '58. Professor Sachs was invited by our own Professor Peter Chow, who's here, and I want to thank Peter for all his diligence in getting everything set up. I was also going to mention, if you would like, we'll have some people live tweeting the event. You can use a hashtag Jeffrey Sachs if you want to be tapping away at your devices, and I know all of you will anyway. Now, for anyone remotely well-informed, Professor Sachs would need no introduction. But I'm an educator, so let me give you a little bit of background for the students here. Professor Sachs is director of the Earth Institute, Kettler Professor of Sustainable Development, and Professor of Health Policy and Management at Columbia University. He's special advisor to UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the Millennium Development Goals, having held the same position under former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. He's director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and he's a social entrepreneur, founded the Millennium Villages Project and Millennium Promise. He's authored 3 New York Times bestsellers in the past 7 years, most recently, The Price of Civilization. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jeffrey Sachs.
Good morning, everybody. What a pleasure to be here, and what a gorgeous room. Also speaking under Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato. That's a good inspiration for us. But I do have to make a complaint that I'm giving a talk about global warming on this freezing day. And so it's going to seem completely out of place. What are we doing in April with a 36-degree temperature outside? But apparently there is actually a little bit of story to that, even in the context of my talk. I want to talk today about global challenges, and the U.S. is very much part of these challenges because we face very serious problems in this city and in this country around sustainable development, as does the entire world. And my theme really is about global cooperation, that we need to get on top of these issues. Sometimes, we might think that some of these issues are about other places, but I think we know here where we are that that's not the case. We have some pretty serious social and economic challenges in our own city, in this neighborhood. We have some environmental challenges that came home to us, of course, in the most dramatic way with Superstorm Sandy, where the world's most sophisticated city couldn't keep the lights on and couldn't get them back on for nearly a month below 32nd Street. And Wall Street was really shown, you're part of it too, even though the Goldman Sachs building had its own generator, so they had their own electricity. That's definitely part of our psychological problem, is that the richest people think they're part of a different world, but actually they're part of the same world, and they're going to face the same problems, and those are the problems that I want to talk about today. The reason that this topic is on my mind is partly chronic, long-term. When I was lucky to come to Columbia now 11 years ago, and I was asked what title I would like, I said I want to be called Professor of Sustainable Development. and mainly so that people would say, "What's that?" So that I'd have a chance to hold forth on this topic, because I believe that it's important. But it's also important to talk about, in particular right now, because there's a pretty interesting diplomatic discussion about this issue that's taking place. Yesterday, in fact, I was at the UN and had the chance to meet with about 100 ambassadors from developing countries as part of an ongoing negotiation taking place to define global goals around sustainable development. And I believe that this is an important process. It's easy to be jaded. What difference does it make if the UN sets some more goals? But the fact of the matter is we need some shared direction worldwide right now, perhaps more than ever, because if we don't change the course that the world's economies are operating on, and we don't change the rules of the game, the crisis is going to get a lot deeper than it is right now, unfortunately. In other words, the business as usual path for the world is not a safe one for anybody, for rich or poor. And so last year there was a summit meeting of governments in Rio de Janeiro last June that was called the Rio +20 Summit. It was the 20th anniversary of the Earth Summit, which took place in Rio in 1992. And it was a bit of a somber summit, actually. First, because in 1992, all the world's leaders came, including the then US President, George H.W. Bush Sr., and the world signed 3 treaties that were really important treaties on climate change, biological diversity, and combating desertification, the extension of deserts in the dryland parts of the world. And the US was really part of it then, and a Republican president, which very unlikely in today's circumstances, was there and signed these 3 treaties. And the reason it was somber is 20 years later, first, the treaties had not worked. They hadn't actually changed much of global behavior. Second, a Democratic Party president didn't even seem fit to show up. Why? Because he thought it would be bad politics. Last year was presidential election campaign. No candidate wanted to be anywhere close to the UN and to a global meeting. And that's actually a pretty horrible sign of the times, that that's viewed as a bad thing, dangerous. You could get attacked. What are you doing abroad? And so on. But the fact is, we actually need the global cooperation. So it was kind of somber, this event. But it did agree on one important thing, and that is that we need sustainable development goals. And so it created a process, which is the process that I was involved in yesterday at the UN, of discussing what those goals should be. And that's what I want to speak today about. Why do we need sustainable development goals? What difference could it possibly make? Can you have global objectives, pretty high-flying, and actually make a difference to the lives of people where they live, where they work, where they're getting sick, where their children are going to school? Is it possible to translate a global agenda into reality on the ground in a useful way? To cut to the chase, my belief is yes. That's why I work on it. But it's not automatic or easy. And the reason I'm worried about it is that somehow we have to get it done, but we don't quite know how to get it done. And that's what makes this an especially important time to discuss these issues. Now, okay, good. That probably works. So what is sustainable development? The whole trick of taking that in the title, in my label. Well, the Rio +20 Summit gave a pretty good account of what sustainable development is. And you can download a document if you want really detailed. It's got a lot of UN-type rhetoric in it, but it still is a pretty good document called The Future We Want, which is the name of the document that was the outcome of the Rio Plus 20 summit last June. So what is sustainable development? The basic idea is that a healthy society ought to have aspirations and objectives, and those should be not only the narrow GNP economic growth, but should be broader based. And by the way, I'll leave the PowerPoint so that anybody can download it afterwards, so you don't have to take down every note on this, but you can take down some comments. But the PowerPoint itself will be with you, and you can look at it in detail every day and enjoy it. It's beautiful. And also, by the way, write to me with questions or comments, sachs@columbia.edu. So I think with Peter I answered pretty quickly. He said, absolutely, yes, I'd love to come talk. And I'll answer questions if people write also. So I believe that sustainable development means that a healthy, robust, decent, good society, the kind of society, by the way, that Aristotle was after when he talked about eudaimonia, his sense of what a virtuous, happy life is, that kind of society needs to pursue three different kinds of objectives. One is economic, to be sure. I'm a believer in economic development. I think rising incomes on the whole improve the quality of life, or at least have the potential to. I know that for poor people, it makes a huge difference having more income. It's no joke. So I believe in economic progress, and I specifically believe that the gains in well-being are huge for poor people when incomes go up. So that's part of the objective. A second part, though, I would say comes under the rubric of social inclusion, meaning that economic gains should be broad-based, not narrowly concentrated. And if you look around societies around the world, including our own, this has certainly not been the case in recent times. In the US, the vast proportion of economic gains that one would read with the rising stock market or rising GNP have gone to the top, not even to the middle, and certainly not to the poor, which has become considerably poorer over the last 40 years. And so social inclusion broadly means everybody has access to public services, there's a rule of law, gender, ethnic, racial, religious discrimination is fought against, and especially in the rights of people to their economic prospects and to access to public services and to justice, there's equal access. And the third dimension, which is becoming more and more important for us, is the environmental sustainability. And here, I think we're just entering a new era globally, of which Hurricane Sandy was a welcome note to this city, as Hurricane Katrina was to New Orleans, as the massive drought was for more than half of the United States this past year. And that is that our environmental crisis is actually becoming pretty serious. And we used to talk about climate change or global warming as the things we need to do for the future. Well, here we are. This is it. It started. The signs of instability are everywhere. And the point is that we are really on a collision course with planetary systems now, whether it's the climate system, water, the ways that rainforests, oceans, and other ecosystems function. And it's going to get worse if we just continue business as usual. And the consequences of that will be devastating, unfortunately. worse than we've seen, although we're seeing a lot of harm already. We're seeing food prices much higher than they used to be because the food systems are unstable. We're seeing more disasters, more shocks, more flooding, and so forth. But it's going to get worse unless we pay attention. So sustainable development, in my view, is a holistic concept to say, let's stop chasing GNP alone, but let's understand that what we're really after is a healthy, balanced society. And that doesn't deny the role of GNP or economic gains, but it puts it in a broader context, one where equality, social inclusion plays a more important role, and where environmental sustainability is both morally and practically essential, and where we're not there yet. So the point is, we're not doing this. And since every part of the world is interconnected with every other part of the world in the climate system, disease control, money laundering, corruption, whatever it is, if big parts of the world are really dysfunctional or falling into deeper crisis, you can be sure that the whole world is going to be suffering a serious crisis from this. So I think it's fair to say that no society in the world is achieving sustainable development right now. The United States is falling very far short on at least two of these three dimensions. The social inclusion dimension looks a lot worse than it did 40 years ago. And the environmental dimension has basically been neglected for the last 40 years. And if you read the Wall Street Journal, which is kind of epitomizes in my mind the wrong thinking on this issue, and if you need to find one person, which I sometimes feel epitomizes all that's wrong in our approach, it's Rupert Murdoch, who owns that, and Fox News. He's kind of a walking global disaster zone. Corrupt, criminal, greedy, nasty, and otherwise I think he's a great guy. He's kind of a mouthpiece for what is really, I hope Wall Street Journal's not sponsoring this talk, but the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of propaganda about why we shouldn't care about these things. And that propaganda is doing a lot of disservice for the country as well, because it's really messed up our politics and confused the direction. So the world as a whole is off course. And I think that four reasons that I find absolutely notable. First, of course, I'm, as a development economist, probably most tuned in and attentive to the crisis of extreme poverty. And by extreme poverty, I mean the kind of poverty that really threatens lives and cuts short lives and leads to about 7 million kids under the age of 5 dying each year before their 5th birthday of things like measles, which are completely 100% preventable with the vaccine, or from malaria, which is a disease transmitted by mosquitoes that can be prevented by a bed net or can be treated by an 80-cent dose of medicine, and yet hundreds of thousands of kids still die every year. So that's extreme poverty. And there are more than 1 billion people in the world still living in extreme poverty. Second reason that I've mentioned is the inequality. Most countries have rising inequality right now. Why? Complicated and much debated point. I think there are several factors that are contributing, say, to America's inequality, which has widened considerably in the last 40 years. So what are some of those? Well, first, probably globalization itself has played into this, because when the US connected economically with China, with India, and so forth, there really was a lot of offshoring of jobs. There was a lot of shift of employment to lower wage countries. This definitely hit lower wage professions or eliminated them entirely. Second is probably technology, because the evidence seems to be that the information revolution is favoring those with high skills. We know that the gap of income between college degree recipients and those with a high school diploma or less has widened considerably over the last 40 years, so the skill gradient has increased tremendously. Third, globalization has made it easier for the wealthy to escape responsibility. Their money is mobile. It sits in the Cayman Islands. It sits in the Bahamas. But I don't mean small amounts, I mean trillions and trillions of dollars. And our companies game the system. And they game the system in connivance with the politicians. Last year, Mitt Romney did us a favor. He didn't, there were 0 degrees of separation. There we had the candidate and his money in the Cayman Islands. We didn't have to have just the rich person funding the candidate. We had the candidate himself explaining how this works. And it doesn't work. It's utterly dysfunctional, but it has meant a kind of global system of tax evasion, which is shocking in my view, and a rhetoric that the most important thing in the world is to cut taxes on the rich even more. That dominates our politics. And by the way, while the Republican Party is 100% devoted to this, the Democratic Party is about 80% devoted to this, because they get the same campaign contributions. Their rhetoric is different. The main difference of the two parties, in my view, is that the Republicans do it with glee and the Democrats do it wringing their hands with a little bit of guilt. But other than that, I don't see a lot of difference, actually, in how this works. So I think technology, globalization, and politics have all widened the income inequality. But the U.S. isn't alone in this. This is a widespread phenomenon around the world. The third aspect, off course, as I've said, is environmental degradation. This is nearly universal in impact. You can't find a place on the planet that isn't experiencing climate change and generally adverse effects. I went last year, I've gone a couple of times to the marvelous, wonderful, beautiful, exotic kingdom of Bhutan, one of the most beautiful places in the world, high up in the Himalayas, landlocked in the middle of the vast Asian landmass. And you think, okay, here's a place outside of the rest of the world's problems. But of course, they are a country dependent on hydroelectric power, and the glaciers are disappearing. And the patterns of river flow are changing fundamentally. There's no escape from this. You can go up 20,000 feet above sea level, you can go to the Himalayas, or be on the coast. And you're going to be impacted by these changes right now because they really are global, systemic changes. And fourth, one of the reasons why this is still getting more complicated is that the world's population is continuing to grow, and the planet has already gotten pretty crowded. 215 years ago, a famous book came out by Thomas Robert Malthus. Everybody knows the Malthusian prediction of overpopulation. And in 1798, Thomas Robert Malthus said that population would overwhelm economic progress. He said because population grows at a geometric rate, and the Earth's capacity, he thought, would grow at best at an arithmetic rate. And he made the point in 1798 that a geometric progression will always overtake an arithmetic progression. And so he said we're kind of doomed in the long term. Now, he wasn't right about a lot of things. First, we had some geometric growth for a long time in productivity. And second, rich people, second was the invention of modern contraception, basically, and the fact that as households reached a certain level of income, they made a pretty pivotal choice economically and socially to have fewer children. And as children survived from what used to be 40 or 50% deaths of young children to deaths that are now much less than 1% in the high-income world, richer families chose to have smaller families, number of children. But worldwide, Malthus isn't out of the running yet in terms of risks, because the world population is 10 times larger roughly than when he wrote. So he was right about the long term in that sense. We're at about 7.2 billion people now. And the world's population is still increasing each year, about 75 to 80 million year by year. So we reached 7 billion a couple of years ago, and in 2024, late 2024, I think on the UN clock, we're on a trajectory to reach the 8 billionth person on the planet. And on what's called the medium forecast, because they do a range of forecasts, the UN Population Division forecasts that we'll reach the 9 billionth person on the planet in 2044 and the 10 billionth person in 2084. So we're still increasing population, and that's putting a lot of stress on everything, on natural systems, on the food supply, on water, energy demand, social and political factors, farm sizes in poor countries, and so forth. In Africa, this problem is probably the most dramatic of the whole planet, because being the poorest part of the world, the part where family planning and contraception is least available and least used, the fertility rates for a woman in a poor part of Africa remain about 6 or 7 children typically. And when you factor in what that means for population growth, it's astounding, as a matter of fact. If you project that more or less continuing with gradual decline, Africa's population would rise 4 times between 2010 and 2100. From around 850 million people in 2010 to 3.4 billion people in 2100. But that's also the continent that most straddles the equator. It's the continent that's most tropical, and it's the continent that's most vulnerable to climate change, because a lot of the continent is in the drylands, and it's a place already hot. And so as the temperatures rise, the thermal stress on food production, for example, becomes severe. So this is another kind of collision course. All of this is to say we're not on a global trajectory of sustainable development by any means. And our societies are, in my view, really shaking as a result of this, and the problems are getting worse, and we see that in the most vulnerable places, you can get an almost complete collapse. A lot of the places where we're working in the Earth Institute at Columbia, in Africa, are just falling apart in many ways. Even though technology is better, the possibilities of making breakthroughs are greater. You look at Somalia, or Mali, or across the Red Sea at Yemen, or I fear what we're really facing in Afghanistan, are places extremely poor. Populations are rising sharply. The infrastructure is very, very weak. People don't have electricity. The schools are quite miserable. Of course, there's a lot of hunger. And then climate change is hitting these places in particular because these are dryland places, meaning that their average rainfall is already on the margin, maybe 500 millimeters a year. So year-round, they would get maybe 18 or 19 inches of rain, concentrated usually in one season, maybe not even long enough rains to grow one crop per year. so they tend to be herdsmen rather than farmers. And then the rain is becoming more and more unstable. And what happens in such a situation? Of course, if it persists and nobody's helping, it moves to chaos. People are hungry, warlords come in, destructive political entrepreneurs who appeal to extreme ideologies or who pay kids to be in child armies really take hold. And of course, the flow of arms is extraordinary. After NATO took out Gaddafi last year, Gaddafi's paramilitaries dispersed through North Africa and the Sahel, just south of the desert. And that's a lot of what toppled the Mali government a couple of months ago. But it was ripe for toppling in the sense that the country was hungry, it was in drought, it was in poverty, it was in stress. There was a local rebellion that had been seething for years of the Tuaregs in the north. And then in came this onrush of paramilitaries and big weapons as a backwash from Libya, and disaster, and it's still disaster today. So, and then what does the US do? The US sends drone missiles. And drone missiles obviously is not exactly a response that's going to solve any of those underlying problems. It's pathetic. What can you do? You can kill some people. You kill this assistant chief of the chief assistant of Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, as they say every day, and then someone else comes in. It doesn't do anything. If you don't have a development strategy, if the people can't get enough food, if there are no jobs, if there's no approach for their kids, this is a useless approach. And yet it's our preferred approach these days because the other is hard work and no one wants to think about it. And foreign aid, that's the most evil thing. We better waste trillions of dollars on the military rather than spending some money to actually solve a problem. And that's what we call policy making in modern America. So we know that this is now a worldwide phenomenon. Hurricane Sandy, with our floating police cars down around, I think this was around 11th the street downtown. Beijing last year, also one of the most extreme deluges in recent memory. Bangkok, these pictures go on and on. You could just go online, clip pictures from around the world of flooded cities. If I were updated, Mauritius had major downpours, record downpours in the last few days. Many people died. I was in Indonesia for this UN activity last week. Massive floods in Jakarta recently, and so forth. And yet at the same time, America's been whipsawed by the rains and the drought. And so we had a terrible drought last year. This is our corn crop from the 2012 planting season. It was down about a quarter. Weirdly enough, you know, the American Farm Bureau lobbied for emergency relief, but went out of their way to deny climate change. That's how strange our country is. My view is you have to pass a science test before you get reimbursed for your crop failure. Because this is idiotic, honestly, for these lobbyists to say you keep paying us, but we're not going to do anything about it because we're going to be in the front lines of lobbying to say that this is not scientifically proven. Whereas the science behind climate change has been known for well over 100 years. Of course, we understand it better, but in 1896 already, a Nobel chemist in Sweden, by a hand calculation, he had no computers, spent 18 months to calculate what would happen if the CO2 level doubled. And he published that in 1896, nailed it, almost to the degree, by the way. And the idea that this is some new, scientific hoax, as one of our least ingenious senators, Imhoff, once said, is crazy. But you look at where the senators that make these claims, like Ted Cruz of Texas, I mean, these are simply mouthpieces for the oil industry, pure and simple. They can't be as stupid as they look. They're paid. They're smarter than that. They're paid hacks. They're not such idiots. But the damage that's being done by this process continuing this way is horrible. We have massive increases in the number of forest fires in the American West. This is a graph that came out in 2006 of forest fire frequency. You can see this stunning increase. This is because of increasing drought conditions, higher temperatures in the West, and extreme drought, hot and dry, with the very strong footprint of human-induced climate change. This is what the map looked like for the US last summer, where that dark, it's interesting to look at the labeling of this. This is from US Department of Agriculture. The dark red is called exceptional drought, and the just bit lighter red is called extreme drought, and the kind of beige is severe drought. So, you know, you got to get the metrics right. This is a country with no rainfall through the summer months. And I happened to be in Albuquerque recently, driving by the Rio Grande, and the reservoirs are down 80 feet. Of course, we don't send water to Mexico like we're obligated to do by treaty, because we're draining it all off for our own use. But the reservoirs are down, the rivers are running to a trickle. You know, the Mississippi River couldn't sustain transport. It had to have emergency dredging this spring because the water levels are down so much. And our Senate says, oh, what? We have problems? Worried? No, it's a hoax. But that's big money talking. That is not actually anything else. And this is what the Sahel looks like: dead animals, livestock dying, the camel carcass here with this herdsman in Chad, and a lot of violence. If you look at what the insurance companies are telling us, that's this steeply rising solid line on the left. That's the all disasters line. This is from Munich Re, reinsurance. And interestingly, you know, if you count the number of earthquakes, I think I have a pointer. Well, the earthquake level is flat. You know, we're not affecting earthquakes except very small earthquakes around the hydrofracking. But those are mini quakes not showing up here. But where you do see big changes, of course, are in cyclones and in floods, because these are what are called hydrometeorological events. They're climate-related events. That's what we are changing, and we're changing them quite dramatically. This is an amazing, little bit complicated map, but I want to spend a couple of minutes to explain it. My colleague, Jim Hansen, is a name that some of you will know. Professor Hansen is America's leading climate scientist. Until a couple of days ago, he was the US government's leading climate scientist. He just retired after more than 2 decades of heading NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies. He retired in part so that he could participate in more lawsuits against the US government. He's made a very admirable habit of getting arrested frequently in recent years at protests and demonstrations. He's a genius who has been looking at the climate record for decades, called it right earlier than almost anybody, and of course is incredibly frustrated, telling us it's worse than you think, it's happening faster than you think. And last summer he published this paper that what you could see are 9 squares. Each one of them is a world map, if you could see closely. And when you download this, you'll be able to see it more closely. And each map refers to a particular year. So 1955, 1965, 1975 are the top 3 panels, and the bottom 3 are 2009, 2010, and 2011. And what he did was look at June, July, August, and mapped out the temperature distribution like a bell-shaped curve for each part of the world, looking at the years 1951 to 2000, 1951 to 1980. And he took that as the baseline. He said, we'll use that as the base, and measured a bell-shaped curve for temperature for these 3 months in each part of the world. And then if you get a very hot spell in that place in a particular year, that's like being in the tail of the temperature distribution. So you're out in the far tail, maybe 3 standard deviations from the mean of that bell-shaped curve. And then he made color-coded maps by standard deviation. So if it's very dark red, really maroon, that you're 3 standard deviations warmer than average. And if it's red, you're between 2 and 3 standard deviations warmer than average. And everybody remembers that if you're plus or minus 2 beyond plus or minus 2 standard deviations, the tails of the bell-shaped curve, that's about 5% of the area. And if you're plus minus 3 standard deviations, so you're way out in the extremes, that's just 0.2% chance, okay? So if you look at the period 1955, 1965 by these standards, there aren't too many dark red blotches on the map, because when he fitted the curves, he fitted them so that those dark red blotches would only show up 2 times per 1,000 pixels. In other words, they'd be very rare events. But then he said, let's use that definition from 1951 to 80 and apply it to recent data. So we keep the same temperature ranges for what is an extreme event, and then ask how many of those events are we having now compared to how many we used to have. And you look at the bottom maps, it's all blotched red. What does it mean? It means that what used to be rare is now commonplace. That's frightening. That's a change just over 30 years. That's how fast the planet is changing now. Extreme events are now commonplace events. Now, I don't know whether this day has anything to do with anything, but I've been on the road a little bit, or in the airports mainly, but I was in Berlin recently, a couple of weeks ago. And I arrived in Berlin on March, I think 19, to a full snowstorm, about 6 or 8 inches on the ground. I thought, wow, that's weird. And I was late to meet Germany's top climate scientist. So I called him up, and I made a, not a very good joke, but I made some little joke, you know, nice climate change you've welcomed me with. And he said, oh, no. Our studies have shown that because of the global scale challenges, getting extreme cold events in the high latitude, in our latitudes, in the mid-latitudes, is going to happen more frequently. So that the snowstorm, he said, is exactly what we're predicting. It's consistent with overall global warming. And the mechanism is roughly that the Arctic is warming up faster than the equator, because when the Arctic warms, the ice melts. When the ice melts, you absorb more radiation, and so you get less reflection of the sunshine, more absorption, and since there wasn't ice to begin with at the equator, that effect doesn't happen. So the Arctic is warming faster than the equator, and that's changing the jet stream patterns. And he says that it's making extreme cold spells like the one that Berlin had more likely. I don't know whether this is just a cold day, but it's been a cold couple of weeks, and apparently because of the changing Arctic equator gradient, we get blotchier weather where whatever is happening, whether it's hot waves or cold waves, heat waves or cold waves, will last longer because the jet stream is distorted and doesn't move the weather systems as fast. Okay, I'm not making a weather forecast. I'm just saying how weird the weather is in general. And we're seeing a lot more of these extreme events taking place. And one thing that I've been trying to emphasize in Washington, mainly without any effect, is that these crises turn into violence, like in Mali. And a couple of years ago in a book that I wrote called Commonwealth, I made a map of the dryland regions, which are all these regions shown in green and yellow, and then put the world's conflict sites on that map from the preceding year. And you can see the world's conflict areas are disproportionately in the drylands. And I think that's no accident. I think these are just the hungrier places on the planet. They're poorer, they're more vulnerable. Of course, not every conflict site is in a dryland place, but most of the conflict sites actually stretch across the Sahel. Now we'd have unfortunately, we'd have a triangle in Mali, we'd have a triangle in Central African Republic. You go across East Africa into Yemen, and of course into Iran, Iraq, and into Pakistan and Afghanistan. This is one long 8,000-mile stretch of drylands, and it is being hit by climate change in a very serious way. There's a concept which I like called planetary boundaries, which says that for major ecosystems and major Earth functions like the climate, like rainfall, we're reaching limits that will become tipping points of danger. This is already happening with temperature and precipitation patterns. Another tipping point is the acidification of the oceans, because we're putting up so much CO2 into the air through burning fossil fuels. That CO2 dissolves into the ocean, and H2O plus CO2 makes H2CO3 carbonic acid, if I've got that right. But it acidifies the ocean, and we've already had a reduction of pH of 0.1 unit, and by the middle of the century it could be 0.3 or 0.4 units of pH. This is already a 30% increase of acidity. These units, remember, are in log scale, and we've already had a very significant acidification, and the projection is this will do grave damage to all of the food webs, to every animal that produces an exoskeleton, all calciferous organisms that use the carbonates to produce shells, or some exoskeleton structure, shellfish, and so on. And we're at another tipping point on the oceans. This shows us not yet at the full risk area, but rising rapidly towards it by the middle of the century. So what are the responses to this? Let me tell you the solutions in 2 minutes. The solutions are you guys got to solve all of this, because unfortunately or fortunately, this is your exciting homework assignment, because the job has not gotten done by the baby boomer generation. That would be me. It's got to be done by you guys, and it's going to be the big challenge over the next 40 or 50 years, no question. It's a huge challenge. It's a huge amount of change needed. So this was all hinted at 40 years ago at the first World Environmental Summit, which was in Stockholm in 1972. That was an Environment and Development Summit. It kind of set the global agenda, but the world didn't change. Then came 1992, the Earth Summit. 3 treaties, as I said, but none of them enacted. They're enacted, but none of them really implemented. We haven't stopped the greenhouse gas emissions, the carbon dioxide emissions changing the climate. We haven't stopped the destruction of habitat leading to species extinction. We haven't fought desertification. We have entered into increased instability instead. Somehow the treaty law didn't work adequately. Now, in 2000, a slightly different approach was used. I've been involved in that, so I've watched it and I believe in it. And that was the idea of social mobilization around shared global goals. The world adopted Millennium Development Goals in the year 2000. By the way, just out of curiosity, how many of you have heard of MDGs or the Millennium Development Goals? And how many of you have not heard of them? Which is perfectly fine. You're in the mainstream. But now you've heard of them, okay? So the Millennium Development Goals are 8 global goals that were selected by world leaders in 2000 to show the aspiration to fight extreme poverty by 2015. In surveys, it's been shown Americans know the least about them of any country in the world, or just about any country. But in truth, they're most important in the poorest countries. And there's a pretty widespread knowledge, at least in general terms. And they've had a reasonable effect of focusing attention on preventable deaths, on getting children in school, on raising the productivity of smallholder farmers, and so forth. They've helped to mobilize global opinion. So at Rio Plus 20, the idea was, why don't we have sustainable development goals for the period after 2015 that could also mobilize global action? And we're moving towards that now. SDGs is what I think they will probably be called. Now, the world's a lot different from what it was in 2000 when the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, were selected. Now we have the planetary boundaries are more urgent. In other words, the environmental crisis is worse. Interestingly, the end of poverty is also more in sight because of the information revolution. So we can do more with healthcare, with education, and so on. Smarter apps, better ways to do things. Emerging economies like China, Brazil, India, Indonesia, where I was at this meeting, as I mentioned last week, are taking center stage. Information technology revolution. Demographic pressures, meaning population pressures, are worse than they were. We didn't get that under control. Bigger role of multinational businesses. And greater jobs crisis and inequality crisis. So the world's agenda is different. I put this here to argue that the Sustainable Development Goals need to be a little bit different from what the Millennium Development Goals were. So this is a rough summary of my own list of what I hope the world adopts. End extreme poverty in all its forms by the year 2030. Hard work but possible. Help poor countries to become middle-income countries by 2030. More socially inclusive societies regarding jobs, gender, human rights, access to primary health and education. And you can see how the whole US political agenda is there. Make a transition to low-carbon economy. That does not mean hydrofracking. That means wind and solar power. It means massive deployment of offshore wind. It could mean other technologies, possibly nuclear. It could mean, of which we have a lot, but we have to decide on its future. It could mean what's called carbon capture and sequestration, which is a way to burn fossil fuel, but don't let the CO2 go up in the air. Capture it and store it underground. We need to make a transition to more sustainable agriculture that's more resilient to climate change. And our cities have to be more sustainable, like New York City. There were plenty of warnings about our flood potential but too little action. And some of my colleagues at the Earth Institute had made pretty detailed maps which subway stations would flood, which are the places to make tactically the either new enclosures or emergency responses. Unfortunately, really nothing was done. And sad to say, one of my colleagues, very brilliant infrastructure specialist, Klaus Jacob, who was featured after the storm in many interviews and articles, had warned about it. And he had warned about his own city and his own home. He was trying to get a waiver to lift it onto stilts because he was worried about the flood. And when the hurricane came, he was flooded, poor guy, after having warned about it for years and years. So we don't have the social response yet needed for this. And then finally, new norms for public and private and corporate governance. In other words, we need more accountability, monitoring, and financing around these challenges than we have. So this is my candidate list for what SDGs should be. Of course, everyone has their list now of we're not allowed to go past 10 because we've already had the 10 commandments. You can't do better than that. But up to 10 is allowed. So you can, this is a good assignment also, what 10 goals would you recommend for the world for sustainable development for the coming generation? And I argue that they should form a consistent and comprehensive framework. They should embrace a global ethic. They should create universal responsibilities, and they should mobilize the public, especially young people. Because your world, this is not something you can solve year to year. This is really a 30 or 40-year adventure at the minimum. You build a coal fire, or you build a power plant today, that's a 40-year investment. You put down new infrastructure, that's 2 generations. It's going to take a long time to convert to electric vehicles, for example, but we better do that. But the truth is we have a lot of wonderful technologies that we can deploy if we put our mind to it, in energy systems, in agriculture, in more sustainable cities. And it's interesting, you know, our world has been made probably most decisively of anything by Moore's Law. How many of you know what Moore's Law is? Moore's Law is the idea that was first recognized by Gordon Moore when he was head of Intel back in 1965. And he plotted the data from the 1950s to the 1960s of the number of transistors on an integrated circuit. And he noticed, because of improvements of being able to make ICs, that the number of, or the density of transistors was increasing, doubling every 18 to 24 months. And he plotted that on semi-log paper and then projected that this would continue. Now, a doubling every 18 months is pretty good. If you think about compound growth, if you doubling every 18 months from then till now has, and he turned out to be right, that has continued till today. And the most recent industry assessments are there's probably another 10 years or so of this doubling ahead still. Roughly speaking, this has been a 1 billion-fold improvement in the ability to manage data, whether it's to process it in a central processing unit, whether it's to store it, or whether it's to transmit it. That's our knowledge revolution. That's why we can stream movies, why there's 7 billion people with mobile phones, why 3G is becoming ubiquitous, why social media and the internet is possible, because of Moore's Law applied over now more than a 50-year period. That kind of geometric growth of capacity is showing up in other technologies as well. And a less famous and in a way less dramatic version is called Swanson's Law. Swanson's law is about the progress in solar power. It's about the efficiency gains in photovoltaics. And the observation of Swanson is that every doubling of capacity in PV and photovoltaics, that's solar panels, has led to a 20% drop in their cost. And so solar panels that in 1977 cost $77, after Swanson's law has taken effect, were just 74 cents per watt last year. This makes it possible to envision solar panels across Mali, electricity in villages where people never had it, bringing internet and schools to kids where they haven't ever seen a book before, bringing health care to people that have never seen a doctor, having a doctor read from a distance, what's this lesion, what's this skin infection, read an x-ray maybe 5,000 miles away in India in a radiology team. All of this is just within reach. You guys just have to write the apps for it. This is the new potential. And this is what makes it possible to change direction. So we need to do it. And since I am a professor and you are students, this is a homework assignment. And as I like to say, you have 40 years to complete it. It is open book, and you must work in groups. Thank you very much.
We want to thank Professor Sachs to give us such a brilliant and very comprehensive presentation about the sustainable development. Many of you have macro, and some of you are in my macro class. In macro, I only emphasize that the macro is a short-term stabilization, not a long-term growth, not belong to a separate course or economic growth and somebody called development. It's a separate course. We are very fortunate in his very, very busy schedule. He will be willing to share his time with us. May I request all of us give him a big, big applause one more time. Now, are you willing to take some questions?
Yeah, if there's time.
Yeah. Okay, I know some of you have another class you have to go, but please leave quietly if you have to go. But we can entertain a couple of questions. Please raise your hand quickly. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, quickly, short.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. You mentioned some of the population, UN population predictions. Do you think there were also some good news? In other words, an inevitable sort of rounding out of the curve. And I know there's a hesitance about good news. We don't do well on it. We might be complacent. But it also gives us a glimmer of hope.
Absolutely. Good. So that's one. Let's take 4 quick questions.
Okay, second one, quick, please.
My question was about inequality. Here it talked a lot about that it's bad, and I understand that the effects of it are bad, but I'm wondering what's bad about inequality inherently?
Got it.
Okay. Third question, yes, please.
Professor Sachs, given the reluctance of developing countries to adopt the Kyoto Protocol, what is in the way of reaching the MDGs since we're only 2 years away?
Yeah.
Okay. One more.
One more.
Yes.
I wanted to know what you think about the notion of the global cycles that have been going on way before we were here, and what their effects are and how they.
Especially climate cycle.
Right. Climate cycle, but going back millions of
Yep, got it. Okay, good. Okay. Very good. Thanks a lot. So on population, just to give you an example, around 1970, the world was growing 2% per year in population. And that means a doubling time of about every 35 years. Now the world is growing at 1% population. That's good. Population growth is slowing, for sure. But the population is twice the size it was then, So the absolute numbers, 1% of a population twice the size of 2% growth, is the same 75 to 80 million absolute numbers of increase per year. We are within reach, though, if family planning and contraception is available to poor people, if poor girls in particular are enabled to stay in school rather than being married at age 12 in a rural community, if women are empowered, if these things happen, then the fertility rate could come down sharply, and we could stabilize the world's population, not at anything close to 7 billion because the momentum of the young is so large, but probably between 8 and 8.5 billion by the middle of the century, and then the numbers would gently start to come down, actually, maybe to 6.5 billion by the end of the century. That's the low population variant. The high population variant has us reaching 12 billion plus, and the medium variant, as I said, has the world growing to about 10.1 billion by the end of the century. I think we need to do a lot better. There are reasons to believe that we could, and in our work in poor traditional communities in Africa, if family planning is available, people want contraception. They line up, they'll queue for hours for the implants. Husbands and wives, imams. It's not religion, it's not gender. People actually want the services now. They're often too poor to get it. So I think there is a real potential to get global population stabilization. Why is income inequality bad? I think, first, poverty itself is bad in the sense that it means a lot of suffering. And so the first issue in my mind is ending extreme poverty from a moral and an ethical point of view. But I think the problem with inequality, the way we have it in the US, for example, is not only the gaps and the abuses of power at the top, in my opinion, which is pretty criminal, but also the fact that inequality makes it very, very, very hard for poor people to escape from their situation. So it is also very low social mobility. America, which prided itself on the greatest social mobility from rags to riches myth of America, now shows up as one of the lowest social mobility countries in the high-income world. If you're born into poverty, it's very hard to get out. And on average, statistically, we're doing a worse job than most places now. Tuitions, you know, I don't have to tell anybody here any of this. Tuitions are very high. It's very hard for kids to stay in school. Neighborhoods, quality of schools, it's all very tough. To me, inequality is therefore the huge waste of our potential and our resources. And, you know, people say, why should we waste money on the poor? Just as a simple point, aside from the ethical point, which I believe is important, which is that the rich have, God knows what you do with $1 billion, and God knows what you do with $10 billion. There's no way in how many lifetimes you could actually make use of that. But the problem is that the highest returns in our society are children. That's always true. The biggest returns in society are investing in healthy, well-educated children, period. And we're wasting that investment in this country massively. So it's stupid. It's a waste, but it's also profoundly unethical in my view, but it's also purely a waste. This isn't kind of inequality of just people working harder, not working harder, bouncing back and forth with a little bit of luck and not luck. It's tracking a society between rich and poor and condemning a lot of people to get stuck on the lower track. And that's what breaks a society apart. And it's what makes, you know, we have all this unemployment problem and all the rest. People who think, and I've been complaining about my Keynesian colleagues who say just a little bit more stimulus and we'll get the result. I don't believe it. I think we have to invest in skills, invest in technology, invest in longer-term approaches, because I think we have real structural problems. And if we invested in fighting inequality, we'd actually invest in higher productivity. It's not a trade-off. It goes exactly in the same direction. In terms of reaching the MDGs in the next couple of years, it's also a matter of targeted investments. I've identified, as advisor to the Secretary General, a few very high productive investments. The one that I am spending a lot of time on is training people in poor communities to be health workers, health outreach workers, not doctors and nurses. That's years of investment. But a young woman, high school graduate in a village, can save lives if she's empowered with a smartphone, with a backpack with anti-malaria medicines, with a bed net to protect against malaria, with some antibiotics. So we're trying to mobilize 1 million community health workers in Africa by the end of 2015. That's an example of something that could be done quickly, low cost, dramatic breakthroughs. And I'm trying to get everyone that I can find, ministers of health, African leaders, heads of telecom companies, and others, to focus on this right now, because it's a huge return, very timely, and it would make a difference even up to 2015. Then finally, on global climate cycles, you know, the world has large natural climate variation. That's how we learn a lot about how the Earth's climate systems work. The most dramatic of these variations are the ice ages. And we've been through cycles of ice ages and deglaciations, they're called, so the retreat of the glaciers. We're in an interglacial right now. The Pleistocene was our last ice age. Now we're in the Holocene. Actually, the geologists say we're in the Anthropocene, which means the human era, where we're the ones wrecking the planet now. But the Holocene is an interglacial period. What causes those cycles? The evidence is that those cycles are triggered by changes of the Earth's orbit, by many parts, the way that the Earth circles the sun, the eccentricity of that orbit, and the angle of the axis on which we rotate, the precession of the Earth's rotation. And those are long cycles, and it's very, very interesting. Those cycles are timed to the Ice Age, but the reason that they're timed to the Ice Age is that they change a little bit of the sun's radiation, how it impacts the land and the seasons, but not enough to explain these big changes. So there's been a mystery. You can time the ice ages to the Earth's orbit, what's called the Milankovitch cycle, but you can't explain exactly why, because it's not enough of a change to have this big effect. So what scientists, including two of our greats, I mentioned one, Jim Hansen, and the second, who's one of the titans of global science, Wally Broker, worked out is that when the Earth's orbit changes and the radiation changes, that releases carbon dioxide from the oceans. And the carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas that warms the planet. And so you have a tilt of the orbit, which slightly warms the planet, and that leads to a feedback effect, which leads to a release of carbon dioxide, which then has a big effect of warming the planet. Now, what the scientists have done is measured how the carbon dioxide changes and correlate that with the planet's temperature, and they use radioisotopes and other indicators to time all of this. And that's one of the main ways we know how much a CO2 change will actually change the climate. The difference now is the CO2 is going up not because the orbit changing or the oceans degassing CO2, but because we're burning fossil fuel. But we can use the Earth's history to say what will the effect of that be. And that's why my colleague Jim Hansen's so worried. Because he says every time we've had CO2 go up like it's going up right now, the Earth has been a lot warmer and the ocean levels have been several meters higher. And so all the coastal cities, including yours truly, are going to be in serious trouble. So the Earth's ancient history is telling us something important. Now, interestingly, to bring us completely up to date, exactly how that degassing works is not well understood. Why should CO2 come out of the deep ocean because of this slight change of tilt? So the Earth Institute has the leading scientists, or among them, working on it. And there was an article this week in Nature magazine, I think it was, that had a new approach. And one of the cool things about being director of the Earth Institute is that you can always find the person who really knows. And so I emailed Wally Broker, who is, as I said, one of the world's great geniuses. I said, Wally, what do you think about that article? And he wrote back an explanation, magnificent, of his approach. I said, oh, do you have a paper on it? And he sent me the paper, and it's being delivered tonight, explaining this thing. And so this is not fully understood. This is breakthrough, cutting-edge science, delivered at Columbia University, faculty meeting tonight. You heard it first here. Thank you very much.
Professor, can we post this at our website? Yes. We will post this PowerPoint at the department website, so you can free access to the website from economic department. All right, thank you so much.